The flowers were mine. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the Crescent Veil Casino that night. Not the chandeliers dripping crystal above the high tables, not the low hum of jazz threading through perfumed air, not the flash of gold jewelry catching light as guests moved between roulette wheels and velvet chairs. The first thing I noticed was my own work staring back at me from every corner of the private event floor. I had spent 11 days designing those arrangements. Ivory garden roses layered with dusty magnolia, trailing sprigs of jasmine, sprays of cream anthurium that cost more per stem than most people's dinner. I had sourced them myself, argued with the supplier over freshness, trimmed every stem by hand in my studio at 3 in the morning with Elodie sleeping on my couch and the radio playing something that kept drifting into static. I had pressed each stem at a 45-degree angle, stripped the lower leaves, conditioned them for 48 hours in cooled water, and then arranged them in buckets on the back of my van while my hands smelled like jasmine for 3 days afterward. When the casino's event coordinator had called my studio 3 months ago, she had said the client wanted something that felt like the moment just before a wedding. Lush, romantic, breathless, and a little overwhelming. I had not known then that I was the client. Or at least Graham had not bothered to tell me that the private celebration for which I was designing the floral program was technically a party in our honor. A pre-wedding dinner for his business associates. He had presented it to me 2 weeks before the event as a fait accompli, in the particular tone he used when he wanted me to feel grateful rather than consulted. As though the decision had already been made, and what he was offering me now was the courtesy of being informed. "You'll love it," he had said, straightening his cufflinks in the mirror without looking at me. "It's the kind of thing that gets photographed. Your flowers will be everywhere. It's good for your brand." He had said your brand the way someone says your little hobby. So I walked into the Crescent Veil that night in a dress the color of warm sand, with my hair pinned up and my engagement ring sitting heavier on my finger than usual, telling myself I was nervous for no good reason. The casino was stunning. The ceiling above the main floor was a canopy of Edison-style bulbs and suspended gold leaf panels that caught and scattered light in every direction. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with the fluid efficiency of people who had been trained to be present without being seen. Somewhere underneath the jazz, there was the soft percussion of cards on felt, chips stacking, the occasional bright sound of a slot machine from the adjoining floor. Everything was exactly where I had planned it. The jasmine scent carried even over cigarette smoke and expensive cologne. I moved through the crowd slowly, collecting compliments on the arrangements the way you collect spare change. Politely, without really looking at it. A woman in a silk dress touched my arm and told me the flowers were exquisite. A man I didn't know nodded at the entrance installation and said something to his companion about the quality. I thanked them both. I smiled until my face was doing the right things automatically. I was looking for Graham. He had gone ahead without me to check in with a few people. That had been 40 minutes ago. I had arrived with Elodie, who had been waylaid almost immediately by a man in an impeccable tuxedo, who turned out to be someone's architect. I had told her I would find Graham and come back. I had said it easily, the way you say things when you assume everything is fine. The private gaming lounge was through a door at the back of the main floor, behind a velvet rope that swayed slightly in the recycled air. The attendant recognized me. I had been at the venue 3 times during installation, and lifted the rope without question. Inside, the lights were lower. The roulette wheels spun with a hush rather than a click. The guests here were not celebrating. They were concentrating or pretending to. The room smelled like whiskey and ambition and the particular brand of male confidence that comes from never having been asked to explain itself. Graham was at a table near the far wall. He was not concentrating. He had his hand resting on the lower back of a woman in a red dress, not touching her fully, but hovering there in a way that was unmistakably intimate, unmistakably intentional. His head was tilted down toward her ear. He was saying something that made her laugh with her whole face, and his expression in that moment, relaxed, delighted, completely at ease, was an expression I had almost never seen directed at me. Not at dinner, not on the weekends we spent at his family's estate, not on the evening he proposed with a speech so practiced it felt like a presentation. Around them, a pile of chips had been accumulating. The number printed on the nearest stack was high enough to make my stomach drop. That was not entertainment money. That was our honeymoon fund. Or worse. That was 4 months of a budget I had built in a spreadsheet because Graham had said he was too busy to think about it. I stood at the entrance to the lounge and breathed through my nose. I thought, maybe she is a colleague. Maybe this is networking. Maybe I am overreacting, being dramatic, being one of those women who make scenes and embarrass their fiancés in public. I went through the whole inventory of reasons I might be wrong, the way I had learned to do over 3 years with Graham, the way you learn to audit your own perceptions before you trust them, because enough people have told you they're unreliable. Then Graham turned his head slightly, saw me, and did not remove his hand from her back. He did not startle. He did not look away. He simply looked at me with the expression of a man who has been caught doing nothing wrong or has decided to believe that. That was when I understood. I walked toward him. I did not run. I did not call out. I crossed the soft carpet of the private lounge with what I hoped looked like composure and stopped 2 feet away, close enough that there was no pretending I was not there. "Clara," Graham said, not startled, almost amused. "You found the lounge?" "I was looking for you," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. The woman in red stepped back slightly, not out of guilt, but out of social instinct. Up close, she was beautiful and clearly had no idea I existed. I did not blame her for anything. I was just catching up with some associates. Graham picked up a glass of whiskey from the edge of the table, unhurried. "You should have sent a message." I didn't think I needed to send a message to find my fiancé at our engagement party. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. Something closer to mild inconvenience, the expression of a man who has encountered a problem that he expected to be manageable and is recalibrating. "Let's not make a thing of this," he said, low and smooth, the voice he used when he wanted to calm a situation before it became one. "You're getting worked up over nothing." "You had your hand on her waist." "We were talking." "Graham? Clara?" His voice dipped lower, and the edge in it was not anger exactly, but something designed to make me feel foolish, to reframe what I had seen as an error in my perception rather than a fact. "This is a networking event. This is how business works. You're going to stand here and cause a scene because I leaned towards someone to hear them over the music." Around us, at adjacent tables, people had gone very still. I could feel the quality of their attention. That careful, not watching way, that meant they were watching everything. 2 men at the nearest roulette wheel had stopped looking at the wheel. "The chips on the table?" I said quietly, because that was the other thing. "How much have you spent tonight, Graham?" "That's not your concern." "Our wedding budget." I said, "It's not your concern." His voice had gone flat, final. The whiskey glass was back in his hand, and he was half turned away from me, which meant the conversation was over, which meant I was supposed to accept that and go find somewhere to stand quietly and look decorative and be grateful I was here at all. Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. The shame hit me like cold water. Not because he was right, he was not right, but because he was so certain I would believe him. He was so practiced at it. The way he said cause a scene as though the scene were something I was creating, rather than something he had already built. Brick by brick, over 40 minutes in a room I had never been invited into. I think I would have retreated. I think if the night had continued the way it was going, I would have backed out of the lounge and found Elodie and told her I had a headache and spent the rest of the evening rearranging my own flower stems to keep from crying. I would have forgiven him by morning. I had gotten very good at that particular trick. The speed of it, the efficiency, the way I had learned to get the whole transaction done before I let myself feel anything fully. I did not get the chance. "Mr. Vale?" The voice came from the edge of the lounge, and the entire room changed. It was not loud. It was not sharp. It was the voice of someone who had never needed volume to be heard, who had learned that quiet authority was a more effective weapon than anything that had to announce itself. The guests at the nearest tables straightened almost involuntarily, the way people do when they realize the owner of the establishment has entered and is not merely passing through. I turned. Seraphina Cross was taller than I had expected, and I had expected tall. I had heard about her the way you hear about weather systems before they arrive, in warnings and adjectives. The owner of the Crescent Veil, the woman who had rebuilt the casino from her late father's wreckage and turned it into one of the most exclusive venues in the country. People used words like ruthless and untouchable, and occasionally terrifying, which had always struck me as odd language for a businesswoman. Standing in the entrance of her own lounge in a charcoal column dress with a neckline so precise it might have been engineered rather than designed, dark hair swept back with 2 pins that I somehow felt certain she had placed herself rather than having someone place for her, a single thin watch on her wrist that cost more than my flower studio's monthly revenue. I began to understand the vocabulary. She was looking at Graham. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Graham said, with the particular confidence of a man who has never encountered a woman he could not charm. "We haven't," Seraphina said. She crossed the room with the calm of someone who owns every inch she's standing on, which in this case was literally true. "I'm told you've spent a considerable amount this evening at tables reserved for my private event guests. I'm also told you've been making a rather public spectacle of what appears to be a personal matter." Her eyes moved briefly to me, just long enough to register that I was present and had been seen, then back to Graham. "This is not the kind of establishment where guests humiliate each other on the floor." Graham's expression tightened. "I don't know who told you." "It's my casino, Mr. Vale. I know everything that happens in it." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "My staff will arrange for you to cash out. The private lounge will be closing for routine service." It was perfectly calibrated. Not an accusation, not a scene. A simple logistical statement that left Graham with no angle from which to argue without looking like exactly what he was. She had removed the oxygen from the room and handed it back only to those who deserved to breathe it. He looked at me. His expression said, "This is your fault. We'll talk tomorrow," he said. To me, not to Seraphina. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, collected his remaining chips with the deliberate calm of a man performing dignity, and walked out of the lounge without touching me. I stood in the center of the room and did not trust myself to move. The carpet under my heels felt suddenly very significant. I focused on it, the pattern of it, a geometric gold and cream design, the kind of carpet that has been chosen by someone who thinks about what things look like from above. I counted the shapes. I breathed. Seraphina was beside me before I had registered her moving. Up close, she smelled like cedar wood and something darker beneath it, a fragrance that existed at the intersection of warmth and restraint, and which had absolutely no right to be as immediately calming as it was. "Miss Wren," she said quietly, "would you come with me? How do you know my name? You designed the flowers for this event." The smallest pause. I read the vendor contracts. I went with her. She took me to a balcony off the east corridor, 3 floors above the main floor, accessible through a door that required her key card, and then a second door that she pushed open with the ease of someone who had done it many times without thinking about it. The city spread below us in its customary indifference, lights scattered like spilled salt across dark water. The air was cool and smelled of coming rain, that specific pre-rain smell that is not quite petrichor yet, but is the promise of it. Behind us, through the glass, I could see the muffled glitter of the casino floor, but not hear it. The transition from inside to outside had been so clean it felt architectural, as though this balcony had been designed precisely as a place to unhook from the noise below. I leaned against the railing and attempted to remember how breathing worked. "He's been doing this for a while," I said, to the city rather than to Seraphina. "I think I've known and not let myself know." I laughed a little, which surprised me. Not a happy sound, but a real one. "That sounds absurd." "It sounds human," she said. She was standing a polite distance from me, not crowding, not making me perform composure for her comfort. She had produced a glass of water from somewhere. From an attendant who had appeared and vanished so quietly I had barely registered the exchange. And she set it on the railing near my hand without comment, without drawing attention to the gesture. "The flowers really are extraordinary," she said after a moment. "The magnolias especially. I've had this space done for events a dozen times. Nothing's ever made it look like that." "You don't have to do that," I said. "I'm not doing anything. I'm making a professional observation." A brief pause. "You're allowed to be good at your work and have a terrible night simultaneously." I picked up the water glass. My hands were shaking slightly, which I found both unsurprising and embarrassing. "He called me dramatic," I said. "You are not dramatic," Seraphina said, simply, without inflection, as though it required no emphasis because it was simply true, and emphasis would only dilute it. Something about the flatness of her certainty was more comforting than any amount of sympathetic intonation would have been. I felt the tightness in my chest loosen by 1 degree, then another. "I designed these arrangements thinking this party was for us," I said. "He let me do that. He let me spend weeks on something that was supposed to be a celebration of our relationship. And he spent the night—" I stopped. Set the glass down. I know what it looked like. "What would you like to do?" she asked. The question surprised me. Not, "What are you going to do?" An expectation of action. Not, "What should you do?" Implied advice. Simply, "What do you want?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "That's an acceptable answer for tonight." The rain began while we stood there. Not dramatically, not in a sudden downpour, but in the tentative way rain sometimes starts, testing its own commitment. I felt the first drops on my forearm and watched them darken the fabric of my dress in small, dark circles that overlapped and spread. Seraphina produced a coat from the arm of a chair just inside the doorway. Charcoal wool, soft and oversized, the kind of coat that has been lived in rather than kept. And without asking, she settled it over my shoulders from behind. Her hands were there for only a moment, adjusting the collar, making sure it sat properly, and then she stepped back to her appropriate distance. "Your coat," I started. "I'm not cold," she said. "Come inside when you're ready. There's no rush." She went back inside and stood near the glass door with her water glass, not watching me. Not watching me. Just present in the way that certain people are present. Fully, without demand. She gave me the thing I didn't know I needed. Space that still felt like presence. I stood in the rain and the coat and the strange calm of being protected by a woman I had met 20 minutes ago, and I did not feel alone for the first time all evening. My flowers were inside that glittering building. I had made them to be beautiful. They were, and that was mine, regardless of the rest of it. After a while, the rain came in earnest, and I went inside. Graham called 7 times between midnight and 2 in the morning. I watched the phone light up from the corner of the suite that Seraphina's assistant had arranged for me. A room on the 14th floor with a view of the rain-washed city, and a bed so precisely made it looked like a photograph of itself. The curtains were drawn slightly back, which I didn't change, because the lights of the city at night are the closest thing to company that doesn't require anything from you. The calls came in clusters. 3, then a gap, then 2 more, then 2 final ones spaced 12 minutes apart. Between the 3rd and 4th, there was a text that read, "I know you're upset, but this is getting embarrassing. Call me back." I read it twice. I understood it for what it was. His first concern, even now, was the spectacle. I put the phone face down on the nightstand. The sheets were cool and expensive, and I was asleep in 6 minutes, which was either the most surprising or the most honest thing about that night. In the morning, there was a tray outside my door. Coffee, dark and already exactly the temperature I would have chosen, a croissant with 2 small pots of jam, and a small note in handwriting that was precise without being rigid, each letter slightly separated from the next as though placed rather than scrawled. Breakfast meeting with my events team at 9 if you want company, no obligation. SC. I dressed in the clothes I had worn the night before, which in the unforgiving morning light looked exactly like clothes I had slept in, folded the charcoal coat over my arm, and went downstairs. The breakfast meeting was not, in fact, a meeting. It was Seraphina at a corner table in the hotel's restaurant. A room that in daylight was all pale linen and natural light and the smell of good coffee. With a cup of something black in front of her, reading documents with the focused efficiency of a woman who does not treat breakfast as a social occasion unless she chooses to. She looked up when I arrived and gestured at the chair across from her, with the ease of someone who had been expecting me and was neither surprised nor performing surprise. "How did you sleep?" she asked. "Surprisingly well," I said, which feels like a character flaw. "It feels like your nervous system finally felt safe enough to rest," she said. "That's not a character flaw. That's a data point." I wrapped both hands around the coffee cup her staff had already poured for me and tried not to examine too carefully why sitting across a table from this woman felt steadier than most of my interactions with the man I was supposed to marry. Quieter, less like something I had to manage. "He's been trying to reach me," I said. "I know." She turned a page in her document. "You don't have to respond until you know what you want to say." "His mother will call next," I predicted. Margot Vale, the human embodiment of the phrase, "for appearance's sake." Seraphina's mouth curved slightly. It was the first time I had seen it do that, and the effect was startling. Not because it changed her face dramatically, but because it made her look briefly like someone who laughed sometimes when no one was watching, which felt like seeing a private room in a building you thought you knew. "Whatever you decide about Graham Vale," she said, "is entirely your choice to make. I want to be clear that what happened last night was a matter of conduct in my venue, not a judgment of your personal situation." "But you do have a judgment of my personal situation?" I said. Not accusatory, just reading her the way you read a room when you walk into it, looking for what's true rather than what's presented. She looked at me over the rim of her coffee. "Yes," she said. "I do." She didn't say what it was, but somehow that was enough. We ate in something that was not quite silence and not quite conversation. The comfortable middle space of two people who have been stripped of pretense by circumstance and discovered they don't mind each other's company without it. She asked me once about the magnolias, where I had found that variety, whether they were difficult to source. I told her about my supplier in the mountains 3 hours north, the way the flowers arrived wrapped in damp newspaper, how I always drove to collect them myself because they didn't travel well by courier. She listened with the particular attention of someone who is not filling silence, but actually receiving information. When I left, she walked me to the lobby and shook my hand, which under the circumstances I found so formal and so perfectly her that I almost smiled. "Thank you," I said, "for last night, for all of it." "Thank me by taking the commission I'm going to offer you in 3 weeks, she said. "I'll have my coordinator call." Elodie was waiting in the flower studio when I got back that afternoon. My studio occupied the bottom floor of a converted Victorian townhouse in the old quarter of the city. High ceilings, exposed brick, light that came through north-facing windows and turned everything the color of winter mornings. The workbenches were covered in the remnants of yesterday's prep work. Stem-trimmed buckets, wire, ribbon. The ghost of jasmine that wouldn't leave fabric alone no matter how many times you washed your hands. Outside, the street smelled like rain and coffee from the bakery 2 doors down. Elodie was sitting on the counter next to the sink, eating an apple with the relaxed authority of a woman who has never been unwelcome anywhere she chose to sit. She had her hair down, which meant she'd come straight from somewhere, and she was wearing the expression she reserved for situations she had been waiting to discuss. "You didn't answer my texts," she said. "I was figuring things out." "You look different." She tilted her head with the scientific curiosity of someone who catalogs faces for a living. "Not bad different. Just awake different." "I caught Graham with someone last night." Elodie put the apple down. The expression that crossed her face was not surprise. It was the specific expression of someone who has been carefully not saying something for a long time and has just been granted permission to stop. "Oh, Clara," she said quietly, "don't make that face." "I'm not making a face. I'm making an expression of controlled fury on your behalf. There's a difference." She slid off the counter and came toward me. "Are you okay?" "I don't know yet." I started sorting through a bucket of white peonies that needed to be processed before they wilted. The automatic motion of it, the familiar smell of them, was useful. "Someone helped me last night. The casino owner, Seraphina Cross." Elodie said nothing for a moment. Then, "The Seraphina Cross? How many are there?" "She's famous for being, well, ice is the word people use. Cold. Untouchable. She once had a senator asked to leave one of her events because he made a comment about one of her waitstaff. She was studying me with increasing attention, and she helped you. She removed Graham from the private floor. She gave me a coat. She made sure I had somewhere to sleep and breakfast in the morning and someone to talk to who wasn't going to tell me I was being sensitive. I trimmed a peony stem without quite looking at it. She had breakfast with me this morning." A long silence. "Clara," Elodie said carefully, "how did she look? What kind of question is that?" "An honest one." I kept trimming. My hands were steadier than they'd been last night, which I was grateful for and a little suspicious of. Like someone who has spent a long time building walls out of very expensive materials, I said finally, and occasionally wonders what's inside them. Elodie was quiet for another moment. Then she picked her apple back up and said, very mildly, "Don't hum at me. I'm not humming. I'm processing." She took a bite. "I'm also noting that you've been trimming the same peony stem for 2 minutes, and it's now approximately half the length it was." I looked at the stem in my hand. She was not wrong. "Go home," she said gently. "Sleep in your own bed. I'll finish the conditioning. We can talk properly tomorrow." Graham called personally 2 days later. Then Margot called. "The wedding is 6 weeks away, Clara," Margot said, in the voice that sounded like concern but functioned like a warning. "These things happen between men and women when there's stress and alcohol and business to manage. What you saw was not what you think it was." "And what do I think it was, Margot?" A pause while she regrouped. Margot Vale was a woman who had never lost an argument she had prepared for, and she was clearly preparing. "Graham loves you. He is not a perfect man, but no man is. What matters now is how we move forward, not how we assign blame." "He told me I was causing a scene," I said, when I asked him why his hand was on another woman's back. "Darling, you were upset. That's understandable. But publicly confronting a man in front of his colleagues..." I walked toward him in a private lounge and asked him to explain himself, quietly. Another pause, longer this time. The recalibration was audible. "The flowers were beautiful," she said finally. "Everyone said so. You have a real talent, Clara. We'd hate to see all of this unravel over one evening." I thought about that sentence for a long time after I hung up, the pivot from defending Graham to complimenting my work, as though my professional ability were a currency she could use to buy my compliance, as though a woman's capability ought to translate into her willingness to be accommodated, rather than her willingness to accommodate others, as though the flowers were what had been at stake. I started a draft of a breakup letter that evening. Then I stopped, because I was not ready. Because ending an engagement felt like dismantling something I had built with the image of myself that I had been maintaining. And the image was easier to look at than the reality underneath it. Because the version of my life I had been constructing for 3 years did not dissolve overnight, even when it turned out to have been built on a false premise. But I put the draft in a folder and left it there. And I did not delete it. The call from the Crescent Veil came on a Tuesday, exactly 18 days after the engagement party. Not from Seraphina directly, from her events coordinator, a brisk woman named Maya, who had the tone of someone who had made 10 calls before this one and had a list of 10 more to make. She informed me that Ms. Cross had reviewed my work from the private event and wished to commission floral design for the casino's annual charity gala in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The same 6 weeks in which I was supposed to get married. I showed up at the casino that Thursday with my portfolio under my arm and a prepared speech in my head about how I could not accept charity work dressed as a commission and how I needed to be taken seriously as a professional rather than treated as a problem to be managed. Seraphina was standing in the main ballroom when I found her, surrounded by event staff and holding a floor plan that she folded precisely when she saw me coming. The movement so smooth, it looked like something she had done 1,000 times. "Before you say what I think you're going to say," she said, "let me ask you something. You didn't have to. What flowers would you use for this space?" I stopped, looked at the room. The ballroom was enormous, vaulted ceilings with plasterwork that caught the afternoon light in long planes, arched windows all along the east side flooding the space with the particular gold of late afternoon, walls the color of old ivory that had been warmed by 1,000 events and smelled faintly of candle wax and flowers that had lived here before mine. It was objectively one of the most beautiful rooms I had ever stood in. Against my better judgment, I looked at it as a florist. My speech dissolved somewhere between the ceiling and the floor. "Dusty lavender and champagne," I said. "Something with structure, protea maybe, or artichoke thistle for texture, so it doesn't read as soft. Low centerpieces so people can actually see across the room during dinner. Trailing greenery on the columns. Italian ruscus, something with movement that photographs well in low light. A focal installation near the entrance, something architectural. 6 feet at least. Something people stop in front of before they come in." Seraphina listened to all of this with the same stillness with which she appeared to do everything. Her arms folded, her expression neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply receiving. "That's exactly what I want," she said. "And that is why I called you, Miss Wren. Not because I feel sorry for you. I don't think you'd accept pity, and I wouldn't insult you with it." I wanted to argue. I stood there with my portfolio and my prepared speech and looked at her and found that the argument had entirely evacuated me. "Why are you doing this?" I asked instead. "Because I want the best flowers in the city at the event that I spend 6 months planning each year." A brief pause that was not quite casual, not quite calculated. "Also because I think you're someone who makes other people's celebrations beautiful and never gets celebrated yourself." I find that worth correcting. The honesty of it landed with a precision I was not prepared for. It hit the exact spot I had been carefully not looking at for 3 years. "I'll need full creative control," I said. "Of course," she said. "I'll have the space whenever you need it. Day or evening." That was how it began. Not with a declaration or a dramatic moment, but with a floor plan and a question about flowers and the particular experience of being seen by someone who had no reason to lie to you. I spent the next 3 weeks going back and forth between my studio and the casino. Sometimes during business hours, when the ballroom was open and the staff were moving through it with equipment and samples, and someone was always testing the lighting rig from a ladder in the northeast corner. Sometimes in the evenings, when the main floor was humming with its usual choreography of money and luck and performance, and the ballroom was empty and mine, and I could stand in the center of it and rearrange everything in my head without anyone watching, Seraphina materialized unpredictably, She would appear at the edge of the ballroom while I was marking measurements, dressed for whatever meeting she had just come from or was about to go to, and say something precise and useful about the event's lighting schedule, or ask a single question about the sourcing for the protea, and then disappear back into whatever the actual management of a large casino required of a woman who ran it herself. Once I found a cold brew coffee on my workbench when I returned from a supplier call, still cold, placed within easy reach of where I had been standing. No explanation, no note. I found I was not annoyed by this. I found I was the opposite of annoyed. "Tell me something about you," I said one evening, when she had stayed longer than usual and was sitting on the edge of the event stage with a coffee of her own, reading something on her phone while I worked on scale mock-ups out of paper and wire. The ballroom was lit only by the work lights I had brought, and in that particular half-dark, she looked less deliberate than usual, less assembled, like someone resting between performances. She looked up. "What would you like to know? How long have you owned this place?" 12 years. She set the phone down. "My father built it. He was brilliant and chaotic and genuinely terrible with money, which is a dangerous combination in a casino owner. When he died, I inherited the debt alongside the license. It took me 4 years to restructure it. People thought I wouldn't." A pause. The pause of someone who has thought about that assumption many times and long since stopped being hurt by it. They enjoyed thinking that. They were wrong. Comprehensively, the smallest smile touched the corner of her mouth. "What about you? How long have you had the studio?" 7 years. Started it at 22 because I was fired from a hotel that let me arrange 3 pieces in the lobby and then realized they could hire someone cheaper and less particular about quality. I set down my measuring tape. Elodie joined me 2 years later. She handles the bookings and the business side, so I can focus on the work. We've been building it since. "I read your write-up in the industry publication last year," she said. "The one about sustainable sourcing and British-grown alternatives to imported varieties." I blinked. "You read Floristry Trade Press?" "I read everything that comes into the building as a vendor document." She looked at me steadily. "I also found it interesting on its own merits. The argument for local sourcing was well structured. The charge between us in those moments was something I could not quite name and did not try to. It was not like anything I had felt with Graham, not the careful performance of romantic interest that I had mistaken for love, the going through of motions that looked like affection from the outside and felt like a rehearsed scene from the inside. This was something quieter and more precise, like a hand hovering a half-inch above skin, never landing but impossible to ignore, and impossible to pretend wasn't there. Graham sent flowers the 3rd week. Not the flowers I would have chosen. Tiger lilies, which he knew I found aggressive and slightly funereal, from a shop I had told him twice I did not rate, because their conditioning was careless. There was a card. "I miss you. We can fix this." I dropped the tiger lilies into the compost bin behind the studio without processing them, which was an extravagance and also a satisfaction, and told myself it was because they would have infected the other blooms. Elodie watched me do this from the doorway. "Seraphina Cross sent those coffee samples that arrived this morning, didn't she?" she said. It was not a question. "They're from a supplier she recommended." "Sure they are." Elodie leaned against the doorframe with the settled patience of a woman who has been waiting for this conversation for 3 weeks. "Clara, what are you feeling?" "Complicated things," I said. "About a very beautiful woman who remembers everything you mention in passing and shows up in your space and makes you feel seen without making you feel observed?" She raised her eyebrows with precision. "That kind of complicated?" I didn't answer. "That's an answer," Elodie said gently. "It's okay, you know. It's allowed to be that." I looked at her for a moment. "I'm still figuring out who I am outside of the life I thought I was building," I said. "I know," she said. "But so is she, I think. Just from the other direction." The gala was 2 weeks away when things inside me began to clarify. The way a room looks when the windows are cleaned, and the light comes through fully for the first time, and you realize how much you had been accommodating the dimness. Seraphina and I were in the ballroom late on a Thursday evening. I was finalizing placement of the column installations with measuring tape and chalk marks on the marble. She had stayed past her usual departure to approve the final design boards, which she had done with characteristic precision. Minor adjustments to the south arrangement. A question about the lighting angles on the entrance installation. Final approval delivered without ceremony. Then she had stayed, which neither of us acknowledged directly. The main casino was closed for a private function 2 floors below, and the ballroom was utterly quiet. She had music playing from her phone on the edge of the stage, something instrumental and low, without lyrics, belonging to no particular decade. "Dance with me," I said. I don't know why I said it. I didn't plan to. It arrived out of the silence the way certain true things do. She looked at me. "For scale," I said, because I needed something to say. "I need to see if the dance floor will feel cramped with the column installations extended to the east wall." She stood up from the chair where she had been sitting and crossed the room, and she extended her hand in the particular way of someone trained in something formal long ago and who has never unlearned the muscle memory of it. We danced slowly in the center of the empty ballroom, and I tried to focus on whether the sight lines from the installations were correct, and I failed entirely and without regret. She was careful with me. That was the thing I kept returning to. She kept appropriate distance, held my hand properly, moved with the measured control of someone who knew exactly how close was too close, and was monitoring that line with precision. But I could feel the effort of it. Not coldness, not disinterest, but restraint. And restraint is not the same thing as indifference. Restraint is what you exercise over something you want. "The necklace you're wearing is broken," she said. "The clasp has been open for the last hour." I reached back instinctively. The clasp was indeed open, and the chain had been sitting crookedly at the back of my neck without my noticing. A gold chain with a small pendant that had belonged to my grandmother and which I wore to every event I worked on. "May I?" she said. Not a question exactly. A check, making sure I knew what she was asking and had chosen to agree. "Please," I said. She stepped behind me and fixed the clasp with careful fingers, both hands working with the quiet competence of someone who has fixed small things before and knows the patience it requires. I stood very still and felt the warmth of her hands near my neck and the cedar scent of her close-up and the particular suspension of that moment. The way certain moments stay held between the before and the after, like objects placed precisely on a shelf, neither falling forward nor backward. "Done," she said. She stepped back to her appropriate distance. "Seraphina," I said. "Miss Wren." "Clara." A pause. "Clara? What happened to you?" I asked. "Before this? Before the casino and the reputation and all of it?" The silence that followed was long enough that I thought she would not answer. Long enough that I considered taking it back. Then, "There was someone," she said. I was 28. I thought she was worth everything I had to give. She was more interested in what I could provide than in who I was. The contacts, the access, the usefulness of being connected to someone building something. When the business was struggling, she left. Quickly, without much ceremony. She was quiet for a moment. I spent a long time afterward ensuring I was never again in a position to be surprised by someone I had trusted with something real. "That's why people call you cold," I said. "Cold is what happens to warmth when it has no safe place to go," she said. Then she seemed faintly surprised at herself for saying it. Not embarrassed, but aware that something had come out that she had not entirely planned. I wanted to move toward her. I could feel the wanting of it, like a compass needle trying to find north, turning and turning toward something it hadn't been pointed at before. I didn't. Not yet. Not quite. The gala arrived the way that major events always arrive. Faster than expected and with a kind of inevitability that makes all the preparation feel both insufficient and exactly right. The ballroom was extraordinary. I say that without vanity. I am the person who knows the difference between technically competent work and work that is actually alive. I have made both kinds, and I know them on sight. This room was alive. The protea bloomed in dusty rose and cream from the column bases. Each arrangement hand-turned so the most interesting face of the flower caught the light from above. The entrance installation rose 6 feet in waves of dried pampas and Italian ruscus and ivory anthurium that moved slightly when the door opened, which I had calculated deliberately. The centerpieces were low and exact, leaving a clear line of sight across the whole room so that when you looked from any table toward any other, you were looking through flowers rather than at them. Seraphina had stood in the entrance when the lights came up for the first time and looked at it for a long, quiet moment. "This is what you see when you close your eyes," she had said. Not a question. "You can see the whole thing before a stem is cut." "Yes," I had said. She had looked at me then, with the expression I was learning to read, one of the few expressions she did not appear to manage or calibrate, that arrived on its face before she had decided to allow it. Graham came to the gala. I should have anticipated that. Margot had connections to 2 of the charity organizations being honored, and Graham was the kind of man who appeared in rooms specifically because someone had suggested his presence might be uncomfortable. He arrived with his mother on his arm and a performance of composed confidence that I recognized as such because I had watched him assemble it in mirrors. He found me at the bar. "You look well," he said. The casual tone was worked at. "Graham?" "The flowers are beautiful." He looked around the room with the expression of someone noting a fact that is useful to them. "I've always loved what you do." "You used to call it my little hobby." A flicker. "I know I've been careless sometimes. That's what I've been trying to tell you. I want to fix this, Clara. We can go away somewhere, talk properly, put this behind us. The wedding is not going to happen," I said. The words came out without rehearsal, without ceremony. They surprised both of us with their quietness. "You don't mean that," he said. His voice had gone controlled in the way that meant he was choosing the voice deliberately. "Graham, you had your hand on another woman's back at a party you told me was a celebration of our relationship. You called me dramatic when I said I was hurt. You spent money we had planned together on a casino floor and told me it was not my concern." I set my glass down. "I've been telling myself for a long time that this is just how you are, that it's normal, that everyone's relationship has rough edges you learn to navigate. I don't believe that anymore." "She put that in your head." His jaw tightened in the particular way that meant the performance was beginning to cost him. "Seraphina Cross, she's been—" "Graham." I kept my voice quiet, level. "You lost me when you told me not to make a scene. Seraphina had nothing to do with it. She gave me a room to breathe in. That was all she did that night. Everything else I worked out myself." "A room to breathe in." He laughed, short and sharp. "Do you hear how that sounds? You've known this woman for 3 weeks, and There's no us left to cost," I said. "I'm sorry, but there isn't." He looked at me for a moment. He straightened his jacket with one hand, the gesture automatic, and said, "My mother warned me you were always a little too sensitive for this kind of life." Then he walked away. I stood very still. The room was full of music and light, and the laughter of people who had come for a good cause and a beautiful evening. And I was standing inside my own flowers, and the night was not ruining me. Seraphina appeared at my shoulder, close this time, not 4 feet away. "That was remarkably composed," she said. "He's going to make a speech," I said. "He's going to find the right moment and make a speech that reframes this into a story where he was wronged." "Perhaps," she said. "And if he does, then I'm going to say what actually happened." I looked at her. I'm tired of being the person who says nothing and absorbs it. Graham did make a speech. He stood at the edge of the room during the acknowledgement portion when the MC had finished the formal thanks, and he said something ostensibly gracious about the casino and its charitable work. And then he added, in the measured tones of a man making a public wound look like an observation, that it was fortunate the Crescent Veil had such philanthropic instincts, given the rather less charitable nature of its owner's recent personal conduct. The room went very quiet. "I beg your pardon," I said. Heads turned toward me. My voice had carried in a way I hadn't calculated for, because the room had extraordinary acoustics and I had been building an installation here for 3 weeks and I knew that room's silences. "Seraphina Cross did not end my engagement," I said. Clearly. Looking at the room rather than at Graham specifically. She defended my dignity in her own establishment when the man I was engaged to chose not to. Whatever happened between Graham and me was built on foundations that were already cracked long before any of this. He told me I was causing a scene when I asked him to explain why his hands were on someone else at our engagement party. I didn't cause a scene that night. I am causing one now. I find it suits me considerably better. A silence. Elodie started clapping from somewhere in the crowd, the kind of deliberate, decided applause that says, "I was waiting for this, and I am glad it arrived." Seraphina stood beside me. She did not clap. She simply stood beside me, which was its own statement in a room full of her own guests and investors and people who had opinions about what she should and shouldn't do. Margot Vale made a sound from somewhere near the east wall. Graham left. I stood in the room I had made beautiful and felt something loosen in my chest that had been held for years. The greenhouse was behind the east wing of the casino, a fact Seraphina had mentioned once, obliquely, during a conversation about the original Victorian architecture of the hotel. I had found it during my second week of gala preparation, a long glass-roofed structure built against the east wall of the building, full of growing things that had no business thriving in a city's climate, but did anyway, tended with quiet devotion by a small ground staff who were clearly in love with the place. That was where I found Seraphina after the speeches had ended, and Elodie had hugged me hard enough to lift my feet from the floor and told me that was the single most satisfying thing she had witnessed in 10 years of friendship. And Margot had left without speaking to me, and the gala had resumed its choreography as though the brief interruption had simply been absorbed into the evening. Seraphina was standing near the far end of the greenhouse between the night-blooming jasmine and a long row of orchids, still in her gala clothes with her heels traded for flat shoes she'd found somewhere, holding a glass of water and looking at the orchids with the focused stillness of someone who needed something to look at that wasn't going to look back with expectations. The rain had returned. It drummed on the greenhouse glass above us, and inside the sound was like being held inside a very large, very quiet heartbeat. "You lied, incidentally," I said. She turned. "About the orchids in your office. You said they were just decor, but the ones in here are the same variety, and they're being propagated. Someone's taking this very seriously." "They're temperamental," she said. "They prefer not to be watched." "I know the feeling," I said. I crossed the greenhouse toward her, and she watched me come with the particular stillness of someone who has been holding themselves very tightly for a long time and is beginning to feel the cost of it in their hands. "I've been thinking about something," I said. "What?" "Whether what I feel toward you is gratitude. I know what gratitude feels like. I've been grateful to many people who helped me when things were hard. I'm actually very good at gratitude. It's a skill I've had to develop. This does not feel like that." I stopped in front of her close enough that I was not performing anything. "It feels like something I don't have a practice language for, which is unusual because I usually have language for things." She set the water glass down on the edge of a planter. "Clara," she said, "don't tell me you're older than me and I'm newly hurt, and I need time, and you don't want to take advantage of a vulnerable moment," I said. "I have thought about all of that. I have turned all of it over. I've had 3 weeks of not seeing you to consider Whether any of this is confusion or rebound or gratitude, dressed up as something else. And, she said carefully, and it is not. I looked at her directly. I am not vulnerable. I am awake. I am possibly more awake than I have been in 3 years. Don't protect me from this. The rain on the glass, the jasmine in the air between us. She reached up and touched my face, one hand, her thumb barely grazing my cheekbone, with the care of someone handling something they have decided is extraordinary, something they are afraid of damaging. Her eyes searched mine, patient and serious. Are you certain? She asked. I've never been this certain of anything this quickly, I said, which is how I know it's not confusion. She kissed me, slowly, with complete attention and no motion wasted. The jasmine was all around us, and the rain was on the glass, and her hand was cradling my jaw, and I felt the last of something I had been carrying for 3 years. A low, constant weight I had gotten so used to, I'd stopped noticing it. Finally, fully release. When we parted, she pressed her forehead to mine, and neither of us said anything, because nothing needed to be said yet. And some things are diminished by being put into words too quickly. We stayed there for a long time, in the rain and the jasmine and the quiet. There were difficult weeks after. The rumors moved through the city's social circuit with the speed of things that have been waiting for their moment. Seraphina Cross had seduced a man's fiancé. Seraphina Cross was the reason for the broken engagement. There was a version of the story, circulating through certain circles, in which Graham Vale was the wronged party and I was a woman who had been led astray by a powerful older woman who should have known better. That version required rewriting what had happened so thoroughly that I barely recognized myself in it. But it was a version that several people found satisfying, and so it persisted. I returned the ring in person. I drove to Graham's apartment in the late morning because the morning is the time for hard things, and I gave it back without making it an occasion. He was still in last night's clothes. He looked in that moment like the version of himself that had been genuinely charming in the early days, uncertain, a little lost. And I felt something that was not quite pity and not quite grief, but had elements of both. Was it always her? He asked. No, I said. It was always me. I just finally listened. He didn't say anything else, and I left. Seraphina and I did not see each other for 3 weeks after the gala. It was her decision, and she delivered it not as a withdrawal, but as a reason. Investors were asking questions about her judgment. A journalist had made the connection between my name and the casino and was sniffing at the edges of something they thought was a story. The pressure was not subtle. She did not want any of it to land on my studio, my work, the thing I had built over 7 years. I told her I didn't care what people said. She told me she cared what people did, and she had considerably more experience with what powerful people could do when they decided to use a woman as leverage against someone else. I let her have the space, because protecting people she loved was how she expressed love before she had words for it. Because sometimes you let someone withdraw for the right reasons while you wait for the reasons to change. I kept working. 3 new commissions arrived in 2 weeks. I expanded the studio's delivery radius and hired Bia, who had extraordinary instincts for unusual varieties and a complete inability to remember where she had set things down. Elodie kept me sane with coffee and truth delivered without unnecessary cushioning. I kept the charcoal coat on the hook by my studio door because it smelled like cedar and because I had not been asked for it back, which I had decided to interpret. It was Elodie who told me about the investor meeting. She had a contact in the casino's events wing who had mentioned, in passing and with delicacy, that a coalition of investors was attempting to challenge Seraphina's controlling stake. The grounds were various and professionally assembled, but the center of them, dressed up in language about fiduciary responsibility, was that Seraphina's personal life had compromised her professional judgment, that the scandal around the Vale engagement had damaged the casino's reputation for discretion, that the entertainment press coverage was evidence of instability at the top. It was, in short, an attempt to use the fact that she had helped me as a weapon against her. I drove to the casino on a Tuesday morning and told the front desk I needed to see Seraphina Cross. And then I sat in the lobby for 2 hours with a coffee from across the street and the latest issue of the floristry trade publication, which I did not read, and the charcoal coat folded across my lap, which I had brought back. When she came out of the boardroom corridor, she was composed in the way that meant she had been composed for several hours under significant pressure and was feeling the cost of it behind the composure. She stopped when she saw me. Something moved across her face that she let stay there for a moment before she assembled it. "You're going to tell me you don't need me here," I said. "That would be accurate," she said. "You're also going to tell me the meeting was routine and these investors have no actual grounds and you've handled worse situations than this." Also accurate. "Then you can stop looking at me like I've done something wrong by being in your lobby," I said. "This is your building. I'm allowed to be in it." The lobby staff had gone very interested in their screens. "Clara," she said. "You built this place," I said. "You rebuilt it. You restructured 12 years of your father's debt and turned it into something extraordinary. And the thing they're trying to use against you is that you were kind to me. They are not going to take your casino because you helped someone." I looked at her directly. "They are not going to take it because you kissed me in a greenhouse." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Come upstairs." The office above the casino was the same as it had always been: orchids, city view, morning light. But in the particular honesty of that light, it looked different from the evenings I had glimpsed it before. She sat on the edge of her desk, and I stood near the window, and we talked for an hour. Not about the investors, but about the 12 years. About her father and what he had built, and what he had failed to preserve. About the 4 years of restructuring and what they had cost her in sleep and friendships and certainty. About the first charity gala she had hosted alone at 30, because she had decided that owning the casino also meant owning what it could do in the world, and she had never let herself stop. She talked and I listened. And when the silence came, I crossed the room and she opened her arms with the ease of someone who has been waiting but would have gone on waiting. And I stayed there for a long time. She won the investor situation. Of course she did. She had documentation they hadn't known existed, a legal team she had kept on retainer for exactly this kind of move, and 12 years of proven returns that no amount of tabloid whisper could argue against. By the end of March, it was resolved. She told me on a phone call that lasted 11 minutes because she did not believe in extending conversations beyond what they needed to say. "It's done," she said. "I know," I said. "How do you know?" "Because you called to tell me," I said, "and you wouldn't have called if you'd lost." A pause. "Fair," she said. 6 months after the night I had walked into the Crescent Veil Casino in a sand-colored dress carrying someone else's version of who I was supposed to be, the casino held its spring event. I had designed the flowers. I had chosen ivory stock and early blooming peonies and branches of cherry blossom, sourced from a nursery 3 hours outside the city, where I had driven myself in the early morning with the radio on and the windows down, because the branches needed to be cut fresh and I refused to compromise on fresh. The entrance installation was 7 feet tall, the tallest I had ever built, because I had stopped calibrating my ambitions to what might make other people comfortable. Elodie arrived early and stood in the entrance and looked at the installation for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "This isn't nervous work. You always used to make nervous work, where you could see you were trying to prove something. This is different." "Certain," I said. "Yes," she said. That's the word. The studio had grown in the months since the gala. The waiting list was real now. B had turned out to have a gift for cultivating supplier relationships that I had never managed. Something about her manner that made growers want to give her their best work first. We had taken the upstairs room and made it into a proper design studio with a long table and proper light, and a sofa that was technically for clients, but was mostly for Elodie and me to eat lunch on. My name had been in 3 separate publications in 4 months, not as a footnote. as the subject. I had started, very quietly, to believe that I was going to be fine. Not the performed belief I had been carrying for years, the telling myself I was fine so I wouldn't have to look at the ways I wasn't, but the actual thing. The bone-deep, quiet knowledge that the life I was building was actually mine. Seraphina found me at 9 in the evening when the event was fully alive and the room sounded the way rooms sound when the joy in them is real. She came from the East Corridor, still in her dinner jacket, the watch on her wrist catching the light as she moved. She stopped in front of the entrance installation for a moment, long enough to look at it properly, and then found me near the bar. "The cherry blossom," she said. "I know, they're exactly right." "They are." She looked at me. "You're wearing something new." Elodie finally intervened on my wardrobe. Apparently, I've been wearing the wrong size for years, and it was beginning to affect her sense of the world. "It's good," she said. Just that. The room was full of music, and the clean laughter of people gathered for something that mattered. And my flowers were everywhere, unapologetic, exactly as bold as they needed to be. Not decorating someone else's life, but belonging to mine. She offered her hand. "Dance with me," she said. For real this time. "There's no scale to check," I said. "No," she said. "There isn't." The last time we had danced, it had been in a quiet, empty ballroom under work lights, with a fiction of practicality between us that neither of us entirely believed. This time the room was full, the music was real, and she held me properly and close, and anyone who was watching was welcome to form whatever opinion they liked. I thought about the night I had walked into this casino carrying flowers I had made for a life that had turned out to be someone else's blueprint. I thought about a rain-washed balcony and a borrowed coat and the strange gift of being seen without being asked to perform anything in return. I thought about Elodie's face when I came back from that breakfast, and my own reflection in the studio mirror afterward when something had begun to change behind my eyes that I hadn't had language for yet. I thought about jasmine and rain on greenhouse glass, about the specific quietness of a clasp being fixed by careful hands, about the word certain arriving at last like a key that had been cut for a lock I hadn't known I was carrying. She pressed her lips to my temple, a small private thing in the middle of a full room. "Are you all right?" she asked. I looked up at her, at the careful lines of her face, the warmth the casino light made of the silver at her temples, the small places where the composure had softened over 6 months until it was something else. Not weakness, never weakness, but openness. The difference between a door that is locked and a door that is simply closed. "I'm not all right," I said. Her expression shifted. "I'm better than all right," I said. "I don't think I have a word yet for what I am." She looked at me with all her careful warmth, collected and held like a light she had finally decided to leave on. "Try," she said. "Chosen," I said. "I feel chosen." She smiled, fully, without calculation, the kind that reached everything it touched and left nothing unchanged. "Good," said Seraphina Cross, who had built a palace of lights so she would never be blindsided again, and who had let me in through a door she'd thought was sealed, and who held me now in the middle of the room she had saved and I had made beautiful together. "Because you are."